January 1st, 1945. Eindhoven Airfield, Netherlands. Flight Lieutenant Pete Wilson of the Royal Canadian Air Force 438 Squadron stood beside his Hawker Typhoon in the frozen pre-dawn darkness. His breath formed clouds in the bitter cold. 8. Typhoon sat lined up on the runway, engines silent, waiting for takeoff orders. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Wilson checked his watch. 9:15 in the morning. Then he heard it. A roar from the east, low and growing louder. His stomach dropped. That sound meant only one thing. Wilson had survived the invasion of Normandy. He had flown ground attack missions through the hell of the Bocage. He had watched friends die in fireballs over German gun positions. But nothing prepared him for what came next. Over the tree line, 50 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared. Flying at rooftop height, black crosses on their wings gleaming in the morning sun. They came in waves. Cannon fire tore across the frozen earth. Explosions erupted along the flight line. Wilson ran. He did not make it far. German 20mm cannon shells ripped through his Typhoon and caught him in the open. He fell mortally wounded as the attack unfolded around him. His squadron lost 8 aircraft before a single engine started. This was Operation Bodenplatte, the last major offensive action of the German Luftwaffe. The day Hitler threw nearly 1,000 of his remaining fighters against Allied airfields across Belgium, Holland and France. The day the Luftwaffe destroyed itself. The morning of January 1st, 1945 should have been quiet. Allied pilots across northwest Europe were nursing hangovers from New Year celebrations. The war seemed almost won. Paris was liberated. The Rhine was in sight. Since D-Day 6 months earlier, Allied air superiority had been absolute. German fighters rarely appeared in daylight. The Luftwaffe was finished, or so everyone thought. But in the frozen darkness before dawn, something unprecedented was happening. Across a dozen German airfields from the Ruhr to the Rhine, ground crews worked through the night. They fueled every operational fighter. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, even night fighters pressed into daylight service. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms, stamping their feet against the cold. Most were teenagers. Some had barely 20 hours of combat time. They looked at maps spread across tables, maps marked with Allied airfield locations. 19-year-old Sergeant Werner Molger of Jagdgeschwader 2 walked out to the flight line at his base and stopped in his tracks. He later remembered the sight with perfect clarity. 50 Focke-Wulf 190 D9 fighters lined up wingtip to wingtip. Engines already running. Exhaust flames flickering in the moonlight. He had never seen so many aircraft in one place. Every fighter the unit possessed. Every pilot available. This was not a normal mission. The operation was the brainchild of Brigadier General Dietrich Peltz, just 30 years old, a dive bomber specialist, not a fighter pilot, but ambitious and loyal to Hitler when loyalty mattered most. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter force, had wanted something different. He had proposed the Great Blow, a massive aerial ambush of one American bomber raid, 2,000 fighters attacking in overwhelming strength, shoot down 400 or 500 bombers in a single day, knock the 8th Air Force out of the war for months. Hitler rejected it. Not ambitious enough, not bold enough. Hitler wanted the fighters destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Peltz planned exactly that. Operation Bodenplatte. The name meant base plate, a reminder to fly on the deck, treetop level, below radar. Attack at dawn when the enemy was weakest. Destroy everything. Aircraft, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, maintenance facilities. Cripple Allied air power in a single morning. The plan was breathtaking in its scope. 16 Allied airfields targeted simultaneously. Nearly 900 German fighters committed. Every fighter unit on the Western Front. Even night fighter squadrons stripped from home defense. Junkers 88s would lead the way as pathfinders. Dropping flares at checkpoints, the fighters would follow at 50 meters altitude. Too low for radar, too fast for reaction. Arrive over the targets at exactly 9:20 in the morning, just after sunrise, when most aircraft would still be on the ground. Secrecy was absolute, so absolute it became a death sentence. German anti-aircraft batteries were not informed. Naval flak units protecting V-2 launch sites received no warning. Even Wehrmacht infantry positions along the front had no idea. Peltz believed surprise was everything. He was right about the Allies. He was catastrophically wrong about his own forces. The weather had delayed everything. Bodenplatte was originally planned for December 16, 1944. The same day as the Battle of the Bulge. The same bad weather that kept Allied planes grounded also kept German fighters on the ground. Day after day, the operation was postponed. Pilots waited. Aircraft sat fueled and ready. The great gamble was ready to roll. By late December, the window was closing. The Battle of the Bulge had stalled. American tanks were counterattacking. British forces were containing the northern shoulder. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd. Then the carnage began. Not from Bodenplatte, but from Allied air power suddenly unleashed. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Allied fighters and bombers swarmed over German positions. The Luftwaffe lost 98 aircraft. 98 irreplaceable fighters and their pilots. Gone in a single day. Christmas Day brought more slaughter. 62 aircraft lost. 49 pilots dead or missing. December 26th, Boxing Day. Another 60 aircraft destroyed. Another 49 pilots killed. Peltz was trying to save his strike force for Bodenplatte while also defending the shrinking Bulge salient. He could only put up 400 fighters against 3,500 Allied aircraft. His carefully hoarded reserve was being bled white before the operation even began. On the ground, the situation was desperate. The 2nd Panzer Division had reached within sight of the Meuse River. Then it was cut to pieces by American and British tanks. Bastogne was relieved on Boxing Day. Patton's Third Army broke through. The offensive was collapsing. Every day mattered now. Peltz pushed for immediate execution. The weather forecast showed one clear day. January 1st, 1945. New Year's Day. It would have to be enough. At 8:22 in the morning, the first aircraft took off from Gütersloh Air Base. Then the sky filled with aircraft. From a dozen airfields, the formations rose. They assembled at low altitude, staying below Allied radar coverage. The noise was tremendous. Hundreds of engines, the largest Luftwaffe operation in months, possibly the last they would ever mount. The pilots flew in tight formation. Many were inexperienced. Some had never flown a combat mission. They followed their leaders, followed the Junkers. 88 Pathfinders dropping flares ahead. The formation streaked west at treetop height, over German lines, over the frozen landscape of the Ardennes, into Allied-controlled territory. On Walcheren, island in the Scheldt River, Corporal Geoffrey Kuki was manning a radar station atop a lighthouse. He had the highest vantage point for miles. At 9 was in the morning, he looked up from his equipment and froze. The sky was full of aircraft, German aircraft, flying so low they passed on both sides of his lighthouse position. He counted them in disbelief. Dozens, hundreds, all headed west toward Belgium and Holland. He grabbed his radio, tried to warn somebody, anybody. At airfield Y-29 near Asch in Belgium, the American 352nd Fighter Group was just waking up. Most pilots had celebrated hard the night before. New Year's Eve. They had earned it. The 352nd flew P-51 Mustangs, the best fighter in the European theatre. They had air superiority. The war was almost over. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer had requested a dawn patrol, just in case. His request was denied. No need. The Germans were finished. At Eindhoven in Holland, the situation was similar. 3 Canadian Typhoon squadrons of 143 Wing were preparing for routine missions. The 438th and 439th squadrons had aircraft lined up on the runway. 8 Typhoons from each unit, ready for takeoff, Flight Lieutenant Pete Wilson of 438 Squadron was doing his final checks. Behind him, the rest of 143 Wing's aircraft sat in their dispersal areas. 60 Typhoons total. Also on the field were reconnaissance Spitfires of 39 Wing, transport aircraft, repair units, over 100 aircraft on one airfield. At Brussels Ever Airfield, Wing Commander Johnny Johnson commanded 127 Wing. Johnson was a Battle of Britain veteran, 38 confirmed kills, one of the RAF's greatest fighter pilots. His Spitfires were parked in neat rows. It was cold, quiet. The first morning of 1945. Johnson was probably thinking about breakfast. At 9:15, everything changed. At Eindhoven, Pete Wilson heard the sound first, then saw them. The Focke-Wulfs came in from the east, 50 aircraft, flying so low their propellers kicked up snow. They opened fire while still 500 meters out. 20mm cannon shells walked across the frozen ground, tore into parked aircraft. Typhoons exploded, fuel tanks ruptured, black smoke boiled into the clear sky. The 8 Typhoons on the runway became death traps. Pilots tried to run. Some made it. Wilson did not. Cannon fire caught him between his aircraft and the control truck. He went down hard, mortally wounded. Around him, the attack continued. The Germans made multiple passes, methodical, efficient. They strafed buildings, set fire to fuel dumps, destroyed everything they could see. But something unexpected happened. 31 Spitfires from the 3 Polish squadrons of 131 Wing were already in the air. They had taken off earlier for bombing missions. Now they heard the radio calls. Their airfield was under attack. They jettisoned their bombs and dove for home, low on fuel. But angry, very angry. Lieutenant Wacław Chojnacki of 308 Squadron arrived first. He had returned early with mechanical trouble. He saw the Focke-Wulfs tearing apart his base, saw his friend's aircraft burning. He attacked immediately. Alone against 50, he shot down one Focke-Wulf, watched it crash into a B-17 on the field. Then the Germans swarmed him. He was outnumbered 50-1. There could be only one outcome. Chojnacki was shot down and killed. But his sacrifice bought time. The other Polish pilots arrived. They had no fuel for maneuvering, no altitude advantage, but they had rage. A massive dogfight erupted at treetop level. Over the airfield, over the town, over open country. Focke-Wulfs and Spitfires chasing each other between buildings. Both sides were critically low on fuel. This would be quick and brutal. The Polish pilots claimed 14 Focke-Wulfs destroyed. They lost 2 of their own in the air combat. On the ground, the damage was catastrophic. 18 Spitfires destroyed, a B-17 Flying Fortress, a short Sterling, 4 Avro Ansons, a Mosquito, an Oster, 3 Polish ground crew killed, 18 wounded. But it could have been worse. Much worse. If those 31 Spitfires had been on the ground, the entire wing would have been wiped out. At Y-29 Ash, the Americans faced a similar hell. Jagdgeschwader 11 hit the base at 9:20. P-51 Mustangs were caught taxiing. Some pilots managed to scramble. Most did not. The initial strafing run destroyed or damaged 24 aircraft. But some Americans got airborne. Lieutenant Alden Rigby was one of them. He clawed his Mustang into the air as German fighters strafed the runway. He found himself in the middle of a massive dogfight. At low altitude. No room for error. The Americans who got airborne fought like demons. They claimed 63 confirmed kills, plus 6 shared. This was not the walkover the Germans expected. American light anti-aircraft batteries tore into the low-flying attackers. Quad 50 caliber machine guns were devastating. Some German pilots had never experienced ground fire like this. They died by the dozens. At airfield after airfield, the pattern repeated. Initial success. Surprise achieved. Aircraft destroyed on the ground. Then the response. Allied fighters scrambling. Ground fire opening up. And the killing began. At Brussels Ever, Johnny Johnson's 127 Wing lost 32 fighters. 22 transport aircraft. 13 4-engine bombers. But the attacking Germans paid heavily. Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 19 aircraft. 13 pilots killed or captured. At St. Denis Westrom, 36 Focke-Wulfs caught the airfield at 9:30. 18 Spitfires destroyed on the ground. But again, Polish squadrons were already airborne. They returned to find their base under attack. The resulting dogfight was savage. The Poles claimed 14 Germans destroyed, lost 2 of their own. The attacks continued across Belgium and Holland. Some were successful, some were disasters. At Muldegem and Ursel, Significant damage was inflicted. At Le Culot, almost nothing happened. The Germans could not even find the airfield. At Volkel, which housed the feared Hawker Tempests, the attackers completely missed their target. 4 entire groups of Focke-Wulf searched and found nothing. The Tempests sat untouched. The confusion was systematic. Many German pilots had minimal navigation training. They had learned to fly in formation and follow their leaders. Nothing more. When leaders were shot down, formations disintegrated. Pilots got lost. Some stumbled on the wrong airfields entirely. Jagdgeschwader 4 was supposed to attack Le Culot. They found an airfield and attacked it. It was Sint-Truiden. Home to American P-47 Thunderbolts, the Americans lost 10 destroyed and 31 damaged, but the Germans lost 8 aircraft for hitting the wrong target. Then came the flight home, and this is where Operation Bodenplatte transformed from costly failure into absolute catastrophe. The German anti-aircraft batteries had not been informed. Peltzer's obsession with secrecy had created a death trap. As German fighters streamed back east at low altitude, their own flak batteries opened fire. From the Rhine to the Ruhr, German 88 mm guns tracked low-flying aircraft. They saw aircraft at treetop height flying toward Germany. They had not been told about Bodenplatte. They assumed the aircraft were Allied. They fired. The slaughter was immense. Some estimates suggest up to a quarter of German losses that day came from friendly fire. Fighters limping home damaged from combat were blown apart by their own guns. Aircraft low on fuel were shot down miles from their bases. Pilots who survived the Allied response died over their own lines. V-2 launch sites around The Hague were particularly deadly. Naval flak units protecting the missile batteries had standing orders. Shoot anything that comes near. They did. Multiple German aircraft were destroyed within sight of their own rocket positions. One pilot managed to belly land after taking friendly fire. When he climbed out, German troops arrested him. They thought he was Allied. It took hours to sort out. By noon, it was over. The survivors straggled back to their bases. The losses were counted. The numbers were staggering. 271 German fighters destroyed. 89 more damaged. But the aircraft could be replaced. Germany was still producing fighters at remarkable rates. Nearly 25,000 had been built in 1944 alone. The factories were still running. New aircraft could be delivered within weeks. The pilot losses could not be replaced. 143 killed or missing, 70 captured, 21 wounded, 234 experienced combat pilots gone in a single morning. And not just any pilots, the formation leaders, the experienced veterans, the men who had survived years of combat, 3 wing commanders dead, 5 group commanders gone, 14 squadron leaders lost. Jagdgeschwader 27 was devastated. 17 aircraft destroyed, 11 pilots killed, 1 wounded, 3 captured. The unit would never fully recover. Jagdgeschwader 26 lost similar numbers across its groups. Unit after unit reported catastrophic losses in leadership. The young, inexperienced pilots who survived had no one left to teach them. No veterans to pass on combat wisdom. No experienced leaders to guide formations. The Allied losses looked severe on paper. 305 aircraft destroyed, 190 damaged. But the reality was different. Most were destroyed on the ground. Only a handful of Allied pilots died. The aircraft were replaced within a week. American production alone was churning out fighters by the thousands. Replacement aircraft arrived by ship and were flying combat missions within days. By January 7th, Allied fighter strength was back to pre-attack levels. The Luftwaffe would never recover. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Below, wrote in his diary that night. His entry was brief and devastating. A catastrophe befell the Luftwaffe. That was all he wrote. He did not need to elaborate. Everyone knew what it meant. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter force, was more blunt. We sacrificed our last substance. His great blow had been rejected. His carefully hoarded fighter force had been thrown away in a single morning. For what? Some damaged airfields? Some destroyed aircraft that would be replaced in days? The Luftwaffe had bled itself white for a temporary tactical success that meant nothing strategically. The aftermath was swift and brutal. On January 6th, the Luftwaffe managed to put up 150 to 175 sorties supporting ground operations. It was their last gasp. On January 14th, they suffered 139 more casualties. 28 of the new Focke-Wulf 190 D9s were lost. On January 16th, they mounted one more major effort, again at heavy cost. Then it was over. Hitler lost confidence. The Western Front fighter units had failed. They were useless. A waste of fuel. Meanwhile, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive was driving directly toward Berlin. The capital was threatened. Hitler ordered the fighter units east. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 4, 6, 11 and 77 were transferred to face the Soviet onslaught. The Western Front was left almost defenseless. Allied fighters roamed the skies over Germany unopposed. The remaining units in the West struggled to mount even basic defensive operations. Young pilots with minimal training were thrown into combat against veteran American and British squadrons. They died in droves. Throughout January and February, the Luftwaffe bled out, not from a single dramatic defeat, but from 1,000 small losses. A fighter here, two there. Every day, every mission. No replacements, no veterans to rebuild around, just a slow grinding collapse. On January 22nd, a group of experienced fighter pilots confronted Hermann Göring directly. This became known as the Mutiny of the Aces. They demanded that Galland be reinstated, that the fighter force be reorganized, that the suicide missions stop. Göring refused. He blamed the pilots for the failures, called them cowards. The meeting ended in shouting. Nothing changed. The Luftwaffe continued its death spiral. By March, the Allied crossing of the Rhine faced almost no air opposition. Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity, the massive airborne and ground assault across the Rhine, proceeded with complete air superiority. German fighters that did appear were shot down immediately. The Jagdwaffe could not even defend its own homeland anymore. The statistics tell a brutal story. In the 17 weeks between Operation Bodenplatte and the end of the war, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Fighter production continued. New aircraft reached the front, but there was no one to fly them, or rather, no one who could fly them effectively. Teenagers with 20 hours of flight time were sent into combat against Allied pilots with hundreds of hours and dozens of kills. The results were predictable. German historian Gerhard Weinberg later wrote that Bodenplatte left the Germans weaker than ever and incapable of mounting any major attack again. Another historian, Werner Gerbig, was even more direct. In strategic terms, Operation Bodenplatte amounted to a total defeat. These were German historians, analyzing their own nation's military failure. Their verdict was unanimous. Bodenplatte was a catastrophic self-inflicted wound. The human cost was written in individual tragedies. 19-year-old Werner Molger, who had marveled at the sight of 50 Focke-Wulfs lined up in the moonlight, survived Bodenplatte, but many of his squadron mates did not. The formation he flew with lost 6 aircraft. 4 pilots killed. The survivors had no time to mourn. They were thrown back into combat the next day, and the day after, until there was almost nothing left. Flight Lieutenant Pete Wilson of the Canadian 438 Squadron died on the runway at Eindhoven. He was 26 years old. He had flown dozens of combat missions, survived the meat grinder of Normandy, made it through the autumn campaign in Holland, then was killed on the ground by an operation that achieved nothing lasting. His squadron replaced their lost aircraft within 10 days. They were back to full operational status by mid-January. Wilson could not be replaced. Lieutenant Wacław Chojnacki, the Polish pilot who died attacking 50 enemy fighters alone, was 24 years old. His country had been destroyed in 1939. He had escaped to fight on. France, England, now Holland. He died defending an airfield in a country not his own, fighting for a homeland that would soon be handed to Stalin anyway. His sacrifice bought minutes. It allowed his squadron mates to arrive and fight back. Those minutes mattered to the men who lived. They meant nothing strategically. On the German side, the losses were equally personal and equally tragic. Hauptmann Ewald Trost of Jagdgeschwader 3 was shot down near Eindhoven. He was hit by ground fire, small arms fire from Canadian soldiers. His aircraft was struck multiple times in the port side. He was wounded, burns to his face, bullet wounds to his right arm. He crash-landed and was captured. He was an experienced pilot, a formation leader. The Luftwaffe could not afford to lose him. They lost him anyway. 3 wing commanders died on January 1st. Men who had survived years of combat, who had earned their ranks through skill and courage, gone in one morning. Their loss created a cascade of problems. The groups they commanded had to be reorganized. Inexperienced officers were promoted beyond their abilities. Unit cohesion collapsed. The Jagdwaffe began to disintegrate from the top down. The technological context of the battle made German losses even more irreplaceable. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was flying excellent aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190D9 was fast, well-armed, and could match Allied fighters in most categories. The Messerschmitt 262 jet was entering service. On paper, German technology was still competitive, but technology means nothing without trained pilots. The Allies had systematic training pipelines. American pilots received over 200 hours of flight training before seeing combat. British and Canadian pilots underwent similar extensive preparation. They learned navigation, gunnery, formation flying, combat tactics, and emergency procedures. They trained on similar aircraft to what they would fly in combat. They practiced until skills became instincts. Then they went to operational units, where experienced pilots mentored them through their first missions. The Germans no longer had time for any of that. Fuel shortages meant training flights were cut to minimums. Sometimes, new pilots received as little as 20 hours total flight time. They learned basic flying, takeoffs and landings, maybe some gunnery against ground targets. Then they were sent to frontline squadrons. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. Many had never flown in combat formation. Some had never navigated by themselves. They arrived at their units and were thrown into combat within days. This created a death spiral. Inexperienced pilots died quickly. This forced even more inexperienced pilots to be rushed to the front, who also died quickly. The few veterans left became irreplaceable. They flew mission after mission because there was no one else. They became exhausted, made mistakes, died in accidents or combat. Each loss made the situation worse. Bodenplatte accelerated this catastrophically. The operation specifically targeted experienced pilots and leaders. These men were flying the missions because they were the only ones trusted to lead large formations. They were at the front of their units, most visible to enemy fire. They took the most risks getting their units to the targets. They died in disproportionate numbers. Their loss gutted the remaining institutional knowledge of the Luftwaffe. After Bodenplatte, there were simply not enough experienced pilots left to run an effective fighter force. New aircraft sat on airfields with no qualified pilots. Missions were cancelled because no one could lead them. When missions did launch, they achieved little. Formations broke up under attack because no one knew how to maintain cohesion. Young pilots froze in combat, made fatal mistakes. The kill ratio shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. By February 1945, experienced American pilots were shooting down multiple German fighters per mission. The Germans were no longer dangerous opponents. They were targets. Some American aces ran up incredible scores in the war's final months, not because they were better than earlier aces, but because the opposition was so much weaker. German fighters appeared. American fighters engaged. Germans died. It was that simple. The logistics of the situation also favored the Allies overwhelmingly. American and British supply lines were secure. Fuel flowed freely. Ammunition was unlimited. Replacement aircraft arrived constantly. Damaged aircraft were repaired quickly. The logistical machine supporting Allied air power was immense and unstoppable. A fighter shot up on Monday could be repaired and flying again by Friday. Completely new aircraft arrived weekly. German logistics were collapsing. Fuel was critically short. Synthetic fuel production facilities were being bombed constantly. Transportation networks were destroyed. Moving aircraft from factories to operational units was difficult. Moving fuel was even harder. Some fighter units had aircraft but no fuel. Others had fuel but no pilots. The system was breaking down. Bodenplatte consumed precious fuel reserves for one morning of operations. The fuel burned during Bodenplatte could have sustained defensive operations for weeks. Instead, it was used for a single attack that achieved temporary tactical success at catastrophic strategic cost. Some German military analysts later calculated that the fuel would have been better used defending oil refineries, or supporting ground operations in the east, or stockpiled for defense of the Reich. Anywhere but thrown away on January 1st. The Battle of the Bulge, which Bodenplatte was supposed to support, was already lost by New Year's Day. American and British forces were counterattacking. German tank formations were out of fuel. The offensive was collapsing. Even if Bodenplatte had been a complete success, even if every Allied aircraft on those 16 airfields had been destroyed, it would not have saved the Bulge offensive. The ground situation was already hopeless. The Luftwaffe sacrificed itself for an operation that was already defeated. This strategic blindness was characteristic of German military planning in the war's final months. Operations were launched based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. Resources were wasted on attacks that could not achieve their objectives. The entire German military structure was breaking down. Clear thinking was replaced by desperation. Bodenplatte exemplified this perfectly. Hitler demanded action. Action that looked bold. Action that seemed aggressive. He wanted his generals to show fighting spirit. Reality did not matter. The Ardennes offensive was doomed from the start. Supply lines could not support it. Allied reserves were too strong. Weather would eventually clear. But Hitler demanded it anyway. Bodenplatte was the same. A bold gesture, an aggressive move. Strategic suicide presented as decisive action. Peltz planned the operation to please Hitler, to show fighting spirit, to demonstrate that the Luftwaffe could still strike back. The actual results were secondary. What mattered was the attempt, the boldness. The newspapers could report a great victory. 1,000 fighters attacking Allied airfields. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. A stunning blow. For a few days, the propaganda worked. Then the casualty lists arrived. The psychological impact on surviving German pilots was severe. They had been told this operation would change everything, that Allied air power would be crippled, that they would regain air superiority. Then they returned to their bases and found themselves weaker than before. The best pilots gone. Leadership decimated. For what? A few burned-out Allied aircraft already being replaced. The survivors knew the war was lost. They kept fighting because there was no choice. But the hope was gone. This collapse of morale was as damaging as the physical losses. Pilots who no longer believed in victory flew differently, more cautiously, more defensively, less willing to take risks. Combat effectiveness dropped even among survivors. The Jagdwaffe's fighting spirit, which had sustained it through years of desperate combat, finally broke after Bodenplatte. Allied pilots noticed the change immediately. German aircraft appeared less frequently. When they did appear, they fought less aggressively. They broke off combat earlier. They avoided engaging if the odds were even. The predators had become prey, and they knew it. The final months of the air war over Germany became a shooting gallery. Allied bombers raided with impunity. Fighter escorts rarely saw opposition. When German fighters did appear, they were quickly overwhelmed. By March, some Allied fighter pilots were frustrated they could not find opponents. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The industrial might behind the Allied air forces was equally telling. In 1944, American factories produced over 96,000 aircraft. Britain produced 26,000. Between them, over 120,000 military aircraft. Germany produced 40,000. The disparity was immense, but even that understates the situation. Allied production was still increasing. German production was maintained only through slave labor and dispersed factories hiding from bombing. The industrial race was long lost. This production advantage meant that Bodenplatte's success was impossible from the start. Even if the Germans had destroyed 500 Allied aircraft with no losses, the Allies would have replaced them within 2 weeks. The operation needed to destroy not just aircraft, but the entire logistical system supporting them. The pilots, the ground crews, the fuel dumps, the repair facilities, the supply chains. Destroying aircraft was meaningless when new ones arrived constantly. The Germans had one hope of disrupting this system: kill the pilots. If Bodenplatte had targeted Allied crew quarters instead of aircraft, the results might have been different. Aircraft can be replaced in days. Experienced pilots take months or years to train. If German fighters had strafed barracks and operations buildings instead of aircraft, Allied casualties might have been in the hundreds. That would have hurt. That would have mattered strategically. Some German officers realized this after the fact. They asked why the aircraft had been targeted. Why not the humans? The answer was simple. Hitting specific buildings required detailed intelligence. Maps of base layouts, knowledge of where personnel were housed, better navigation than most German pilots possessed. It also seemed less chivalrous. Shooting pilots in their beds felt like murder rather than combat. So the aircraft were targeted instead. And the operation failed strategically, even as it succeeded tactically. The weather on January 1st was perfect for the operation. Clear skies, good visibility, calm winds. Peltz had waited weeks for these conditions. But the same perfect weather allowed Allied fighters to scramble quickly, to see the attackers coming, to engage effectively. If Bodenplatte had been launched in marginal weather, German losses might have been lower. But coordination would have been impossible. Many units would have never found their targets. The perfect weather that made the operation possible also ensured heavy German casualties. This was typical of German strategic problems throughout the war. What looked good in planning fell apart in execution. The boldness that made operations seem possible also made them dangerous. The secrecy that promised surprise also caused friendly fire losses. The concentration of forces for maximum impact also created maximum vulnerability. German military planning in the final year of the war was full of such contradictions. The comparison with Allied operations is stark. When the Allies planned major air operations, they coordinated everything. Air defense networks were informed. Identification procedures were established. Rescue services were positioned. Intelligence was thorough. Backup plans existed for every contingency. Allied operations were methodical, careful, and sustainable. German operations in late 1944 and early 1945 were desperate. Gambles with no margin for error, the individual, stories of pilots on both sides, reveal the human dimension of this strategic disaster. Major Georg Hackbarth led a formation from Jagdgeschwader 76. He was an experienced officer, multiple combat tours. He navigated his group successfully to their target, led the attack. His men destroyed numerous Allied aircraft. Then came the flight home. His formation was hit by friendly flak near Bonn. Hackbarth's aircraft was damaged. He crash-landed, survived with injuries. His war was over, not from enemy action, but from German guns. Oberleutnant Hans Hartigs of Jagdgeschwader 27 was shot down over Brussels. He bailed out successfully, landed in a Belgian field. Belgian resistance fighters found him within minutes. He was beaten severely, handed over to British troops. He survived the war as a prisoner. His unit lost most of its leadership that day. The few who returned found themselves commanding shadows of squadrons. On the Allied side, squadron leader Johnny Baldwin of the RAF was leading 610 Squadron when Bodenplatte struck. His unit was caught on the ground at Maldegem. 14 Spitfires destroyed in minutes. Baldwin himself was already airborne. He returned to find his base a smoking ruin. Within days, his squadron was re-equipped and operational again. The system worked. The aircraft were replaced. The pilots survived. Operations continued. This resilience defined the difference between the two air forces. The Allies could absorb losses and rebuild. The Germans could not. Every loss was permanent. Every aircraft destroyed was one less. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple. The side that could replace losses would win. By January 1945, only the Allies could replace losses. The jet aircraft entering German service should have changed this equation. The Messerschmitt 262 was revolutionary. Speeds over 500 miles per hour. Armed with 430mm cannon, it could destroy a B-17 with a single burst. Allied pilots who encountered it were shocked by its performance. Nothing could catch it. Nothing could match it. If Germany could field hundreds of 262s, Allied bomber operations might have become unsustainable. But the 262 required extensive training. Its jet engines were temperamental. Landing and takeoff were dangerous. Fuel consumption was enormous. A pilot needed at least 20 hours on type before combat operations. The experienced pilots who could have mastered the 262 died in operations like Bodenplatte. The inexperienced replacements crashed during training or died on their first combat missions. The jet program never reached its potential because the pilots who could have made it work were already dead. By war's end, Germany had produced over 1,300 Me-262s, but only a fraction ever flew combat missions. Most sat on airfields with no fuel or no pilots. Some were destroyed by Allied strafing before they ever took off. The technological advantage was nullified by organizational collapse. This would become a lesson for future conflicts. Advanced technology without trained personnel and adequate logistics is worthless. The Eastern Front situation after Bodenplatte deserves attention. The fighter units transferred east to face the Soviets found conditions even worse than in the West. Soviet air superiority was absolute. Soviet Yak-3s and Lay-7s were excellent fighters. Soviet pilots were experienced and aggressive. The Germans were outnumbered 10-1, sometimes 20-1. Units that had been bled white in the West were thrown into an even more desperate situation in the East. Jagdgeschwader 1 was transferred east in mid-January. It had been devastated during Bodenplatte and the following 2 weeks. It arrived in Poland with barely 30 operational aircraft. Within a week, half were gone. The unit was pulled back to refit. It never regained combat effectiveness. Similar stories played out across all the transferred units. They were thrown into combat, chewed up and discarded. The Eastern Front became a graveyard for what remained of the Jagdwaffe. The Soviet offensive that prompted these transfers was massive. The Vistula Oder operation involved over 2 million Soviet troops, thousands of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and complete air superiority. Soviet air armies roamed the skies freely. They provided close air support that devastated German defensive positions. They interdicted supply lines. They destroyed German reinforcements moving up. The few German fighters that appeared were overwhelmed immediately. Hitler's decision to transfer fighter units east was strategically correct. The threat to Berlin was existential, but the units he transferred were broken. They had no chance of stopping the Soviet advance. They died trying. Their sacrifice bought days at most. The Western Front was left defenseless. Allied bombers struck German cities and industries without opposition. The Reich was burning from both sides. The final air battles over Berlin in April 1945 were pathetic shadows of earlier campaigns. German fighters scraped together from training units, repair depots, and anywhere else aircraft could be found faced Soviet and Allied air armadas. Some German pilots flew their first combat mission over their own capital. They lasted minutes. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1940 ended as a handful of boys in obsolete aircraft fighting a hopeless battle above ruins. The human cost of this collapse is difficult to comprehend. Thousands of young German men died in aircraft during the war's final months. Not in dramatic dogfights, not in strategic battles that mattered, but in pointless gestures, attacking when defeat was certain, flying obsolete aircraft against superior enemies. Sacrifice by leaders who refused to accept reality. Bodenplatte was simply the largest and most dramatic of these pointless sacrifices. The families of these pilots received telegrams: killed in action, missing over enemy territory, died in an aircraft accident. The official notices gave no context, did not explain that their sons died in operations that achieved nothing, that their sacrifice was wasted by strategic incompetence. The mothers and fathers and sisters and wives simply knew their loved ones were gone. The reasons why mattered less than the pain. Flight Lieutenant Pete Wilson's family in Canada received similar notification. Killed in action, January 3, 1945. The telegram did not explain he died on the ground, that he never got to fly his final mission. His parents had already lost one son to the war. An older brother killed in North Africa in 1942. Now both sons were gone. The pain was indescribable. They survived it because they had no choice, because that is what families did in that terrible decade. The Polish pilots who died at Eindhoven had families scattered across the world, refugees, displaced persons, living in England or Africa or wherever they had fled when Poland fell. The telegrams found them eventually, if they could be found at all. Some families learned of their losses months after the fact. Some never learned. The chaos of war swallowed information as readily as it swallowed lives. In the context of World War II's vast death toll, the losses from Bodenplatte seem almost trivial. A few hundred pilots, a few hundred aircraft, set against 60 million dead worldwide, these numbers barely register. But each death was a world destroyed. Each pilot had a mother who loved him, had dreams and hopes and potential. Their loss diminished humanity, regardless of nationality or cause. The strategic lessons of Bodenplatte were learned and then largely forgotten. In 1965, American planners in Vietnam remembered that air superiority required not just destroying enemy aircraft, but also killing enemy pilots. The emphasis shifted toward finding opportunities to engage enemy fighters in combat, to create situations where pilot losses would be severe. The result was operations like Bolo, where American pilots ambushed North Vietnamese MiG fighters. The lessons of Bodenplatte echoed through Cold War planning, but other lessons were not learned. The temptation toward dramatic gestures in desperate situations remains. The belief that boldness can substitute for realistic assessment. The willingness to sacrifice lives for operations that cannot achieve their strategic objectives. These patterns repeated in later conflicts. Different nations, different wars, same tragic results. The technology of air warfare advanced dramatically after 1945. Jet aircraft became standard. Missiles replaced guns. Radar and computers transformed combat. But the fundamental realities remained unchanged. Trained pilots are irreplaceable. Logistics matters more than technology. Numerical superiority is decisive. Air forces that cannot replace losses will lose. These truths were demonstrated at Bodenplatte. They remain true today. Modern air forces study Bodenplatte as an example of how not to conduct operations. The planning failures, the security disasters, the friendly fire losses, the mismatch between tactical success and strategic failure. Everything about the operation serves as a cautionary tale. Yet the temptation towards similar mistakes remains. Because desperation breeds bad decisions. Because leaders under pressure make emotional choices rather than rational ones. The airfields attacked on January 1, 1945 are mostly gone now. Eindhoven is partially preserved. Parts are a monument. Parts are commercial development. The blood-soaked runways where Pete Wilson died are covered by grass and memorials. Visitors walk across ground where men once burned and bled and died. The violence seems impossible in the peaceful present. Brussels Ever is still an active airfield. Military and civilian aircraft use the same runways that Spitfires once defended. The buildings are different. The aircraft are different, but the location is unchanged. Somewhere beneath the modern tarmac are fragments of crashed Focke-Wulfs, pieces of destroyed Spitfires, physical remnants of that terrible morning. The German airfields are harder to trace. Many were in East Germany during the Cold War. Soviet forces used them. Then they were abandoned. Now they are industrial parks or farmland. The concrete runways are cracked and overgrown. Nature reclaims what war created. The young men who flew from these bases are forgotten, except by specialists and historians. A few veterans of Bodenplatte survived to old age. They gave interviews in the 1980s and 1990s. Their memories were sharp about some details. The sound of engines, the fear before takeoff, the shock of friendly fire. Other details faded. Names, exact times, who said what. The trauma remained. 70-year-old men remembered being 19 and terrified. Remembered friends who never came back. Remembered a morning when the world exploded. These interviews are preserved in archives. Recorded voices describing events from half a century past. The speakers are gone now. The last veterans of Bodenplatte have died. No one alive today flew that mission or defended those airfields. The event passes from living memory into history. Soon it will be as remote as Waterloo or Gettysburg. Names on monuments, dates in books. The immediacy lost forever, but the lessons remain. Written in after-action reports, studied in staff colleges, analysed by military historians, Bodenplatte teaches what happens when desperation replaces strategy, when boldness substitutes for planning, when leaders sacrifice their forces for gestures rather than results. The Luftwaffe destroyed itself that morning, not because of Allied action, but through its own strategic incompetence. The broader lesson is even more important. War is not a collection of dramatic moments. It is a grinding struggle of logistics, production, and sustainability. The side with more resources, better training, and sounder strategy will prevail. Individual heroism matters. Tactical brilliance matters. But they cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. Germany lost World War II, not on any particular battlefield, but in factories and training schools, in the ability to replace losses, in the capacity to sustain operations. Bodenplatte demonstrated this with brutal clarity. The Luftwaffe could still mount dramatic operations, could still strike hard, could still destroy hundreds of enemy aircraft, but it could not sustain the effort, could not replace the losses, could not train new pilots fast enough. The operations succeeded tactically and failed strategically. Within weeks, it was as if it had never happened. Except for the dead. They remained dead. Their sacrifice bought nothing. The fighter pilots of 1945 were the last generation to fight in propeller-driven aircraft during major conflict. Jets would soon dominate. The entire character of air warfare would change. The pilots who died that New Year's morning were the end of an era. They fought with technology and tactics that would soon become obsolete. Their sacrifice was not just pointless strategically, it was historically irrelevant. The future of air warfare would be decided by different machines flown by different men using different methods. Perhaps that makes their sacrifice even more tragic. They died for a cause already lost, using methods already obsolete, in a conflict whose outcome was already determined. Nothing they did could change the result. The Allied advance would continue. Germany would fall. The war would end. Whether Bodenplatte succeeded or failed made no difference to these certainties. The pilots who died that morning might as well have never flown. History would have unfolded identically without their sacrifice. Yet their lives mattered to them. Their courage was real even in a hopeless cause. Their fear was genuine, even though their deaths were pointless. They climbed into their aircraft that cold morning and flew into hell because they were ordered to. Because their nation demanded it, because they had no choice. Some flew believing they could make a difference. Others flew knowing it was hopeless. All flew anyway. That determination, even in futility, deserves recognition. The Allied pilots who fought back that morning also deserve remembrance. They scrambled from burning airfields, took off through explosions and gunfire, engaged superior numbers with no tactical advantage. Some died. More survived. They did their jobs with courage and skill. Then they went back to routine missions the next day. No parades. No medals for most of them. Just another day of war, in a war that seemed endless. This was the reality of air combat in 1945. Not glamorous, not exciting. Dangerous, exhausting work performed by men who wanted to be anywhere else. They fought because they had to. killed because it was necessary, watched friends die and kept flying. The mythology of air combat celebrates the heroism. The reality was terror and tedium interrupted by moments of savage violence. The Luftwaffe never recovered from Bodenplatte. That simple fact is the operation's legacy. January 1st, 1945 marked the end of German air power as a strategic force. What followed were dying spasms, desperate gestures, individual acts of courage in a losing cause. But the Luftwaffe, as an organization capable of affecting the war's outcome, died that morning, killed not by Allied action, but by its own leaders' delusions. The men who planned Bodenplatte survived the war. Peltz was captured and released, lived until 2001, died at age 86. He never expressed regret for the operation, never acknowledged the strategic failure. In his telling, Bodenplatte was a success. Hundreds of Allied aircraft destroyed, a bold strike that damaged the enemy. The human cost was simply the price of war. The strategic futility was never addressed. This inability to accept failure was characteristic of German military leadership throughout the war. Every defeat was explained away. Every disaster had excuses. No one accepted responsibility. This culture of denial prevented learning from mistakes, ensured similar errors would be repeated. Bodenplatte was not the first German operation to sacrifice forces for minimal gain. It was simply the last major example. The passage of 8 decades has not diminished the operation's significance. Military historians still study it, still debate the decisions made, still argue about whether different choices might have produced better results. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Bodenplatte was a desperate gamble that failed, a last roll of the dice that came up snake eyes, a sacrifice of irreplaceable assets for temporary gains. The Luftwaffe died that morning. The war continued for 4 more months, but German air power was finished. On a frozen airfield in Holland, Pete Wilson fell dying in the early morning light. Around him, aircraft burned. Men screamed. Explosions echoed. He had fought across Europe for this, to die on a runway as German fighters strafed his base. There was no glory in it, no meaning, just pain and noise and the terrible realization that it was ending. Not in combat, not defending anything, just randomly, pointlessly, because he was in the wrong place when the attack came. In the sky above, 19-year-old German pilots flew through fire and steel. Some had been in uniform for months. They were boys playing at war, flying machines they barely understood against enemies they had been taught to hate. They followed orders, pressed their attacks, watched their leaders shot down, watched friends explode, survived if they were lucky, died if they were not. Luck mattered more than skill in that chaos. The wrong turn, the wrong moment, one burst of fire at the wrong time. That was the difference between living and dying. The professional soldiers, the experienced pilots, the men who had survived years of war, they knew the truth. This was futile. This changed nothing. But they flew anyway, because that was the job, because someone had to lead the children into battle, because orders were orders. They died knowing their sacrifice meant nothing. That made their courage no less real, but it made their deaths infinitely more tragic. When the smoke cleared and the aircraft flew away, the reckoning began. The counting of wrecked machines, the listing of dead and missing, the assessment of damage. The Allies counted and calculated and began rebuilding. Within days, new aircraft arrived. Within weeks, they were stronger than before. The Germans counted and realized they had broken themselves. The pilots were gone. The leaders were dead. There was nothing left to rebuild with. The operation succeeded in every tactical measure, and failed in the only measure that mattered. The Luftwaffe had destroyed itself. That is the story of Operation Bodenplatte. Not a tale of heroic sacrifice or brilliant tactics. Not a narrative of how the underdog nearly won, but a hard examination of how desperation breeds delusion, how dramatic gestures substitute for sound strategy, how leaders sacrifice their people for operations that cannot succeed. The morning of January 1st, 1945, saw courage and cowardice, skill and incompetence, sacrifice and waste. It saw the end of German air power, and it saw a demonstration, written in blood and fire, of how wars are truly lost. Not in a single dramatic defeat, but through the accumulation of strategic failures that no amount of tactical success can overcome. The Luftwaffe flew into history that morning and never returned.